It was supposed to be a simple thing, getting a bit of space in my own house. But then Maya came into the picture, as she always does, and suddenly the house felt less like my own and more like a stage. Maya is the kind of person who walks into a room and takes over without even trying. She's effortlessly pretty, effortlessly charming, effortlessly the center of attention. It's exhausting, really, watching her glide through life, leaving no room for anyone else. She'd always been the golden child in the family, the one who made all the right choices, the one whose life was always trending upward. Everyone adored her, everyone still does. I was just the quieter one, the one who kept to the background. In the early days, when I was young, I didn't mind it. I assumed everyone was like her. But as I got older, I realized I was living in her shadow. My achievements, no matter how big, never seemed to matter, but Maya's smallest success was a celebration. And it was okay, I told myself, because it was family. Family sticks together, right? But now, as the weeks stretched out in front of me, the pressure was mounting. Maya had decided to hold her wedding at my house. And I had no say in it. None. There had been no discussion. No asking whether I wanted to host it. Of course. Why would there be? She'd decided it was the perfect venue. And I was the one with a big enough house to accommodate all her guests. All her plans. In the beginning, I tried to play the part. After all, what was I supposed to say? No, this is my house, and I'm not okay with this. Maya would have laughed, and so would the rest of the family. The first few meetings about the wedding were almost comical in their one-sidedness. Maya would float into the room, all smiles and plans, and start dictating what she needed. She barely even noticed me sitting there, arms crossed, trying to suppress the rising tide of irritation. The flower arrangements, she'd already picked him out. The color scheme, chosen. The guest list, finalized. And all of this, every last detail, was being done in my house. I remember the day she showed up with a stack of brochures for wedding planners. She casually tossed them on the kitchen counter like it was a normal thing. I'm thinking something elegant, but not too over the top, she said, flipping through the pages with a distracted air. Oh, and I'll need you to clear out this room for the reception. There was no, "Are you okay with this?" or, "How do you feel about hosting the wedding?" It was just an expectation. I wasn't included in the decision. I wasn't invited to participate. I was simply there, in my own house, like a piece of furniture in the background. At first, I tried to help, thinking maybe I could find a way to feel included. I suggested a few ideas for decorations, ones that I thought might add a personal touch. I even picked up some of her favorite flowers from the store, ones I knew she loved. I thought maybe, just maybe, that would get me a little recognition, a little bit of a thank you. But she didn't even notice. In fact, she barely looked up when I handed her the bouquet. "That's sweet of you," she said, barely glancing at the flowers before tossing them aside. But I was thinking something more sophisticated. Something that pops. You know, something that pops. I bit my tongue, trying to let it go. After all, it was her wedding. I wasn't supposed to care. But it was hard. Every day, the tension built. Each passing hour added a layer of resentment. And I could feel it creeping up inside me, suffocating me. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about everything, how I had spent years trying to please my family. Trying to find a way to fit in, but always coming up short. There were moments when I would stand in the kitchen, washing dishes, and I would hear Maya's laughter echoing through the house as she and my family discussed the wedding details. It was the sound of her world, the world where I didn't belong, being built right before my eyes. And every laugh, every excited comment made me feel smaller, a little more invisible, a little more like a guest in my own life. The worst part was the way everyone acted, like it was all perfectly normal. Like it was just fine that Maya got everything she wanted. Without question, my brother, Aaron, who was supposed to have my back, was caught up in all of it. He didn't notice how Maya's plans were pushing me aside. He was too busy with the wedding preparations, too lost in the excitement. Sometimes, when I tried to talk to him about it, I could see that he didn't get it. He couldn't see how much I was suffocating under the weight of it all. He'd just pat me on the back, telling me it was going to be fine, that everything was going to work out. But how could it? I was being left out of something so important in my own life. And he, too, didn't even notice. He didn't understand. And then came the invitations. The day they were sent out, I waited for mine to arrive. But it never came. It was funny, really. I had convinced myself it was just an oversight, that I would get mine in the mail later. But as the days passed, and I saw all my relatives and friends posting about the wedding on social media, I realized I wasn't invited. I wasn't even worth the paper it would take to send an invitation. The truth settled over me like a weight I couldn't escape. I wasn't part of this family. I wasn't part of Maya's life. I had no place in her world. The sting of that realization made my chest tight. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the pile of invitations stacked on the counter, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I could almost hear Maya's voice in my head, telling me that it was for the best, that I didn't need to be part of the day. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. I had always prided myself on being a quiet person, not because I was shy, but because I believed silence was a powerful thing. It was my way of staying out of conflict, my way of surviving when everything around me seemed to be falling apart. I'd learned early on that people rarely noticed the quiet ones, and that worked just fine for me. I could exist in the background, where the noise didn't reach me. I could be invisible. But now, as the wedding day grew closer, I could feel myself getting louder inside. It wasn't the kind of loudness that demanded attention. No, it was quieter, more insidious, like the low hum of an engine starting up, ready to race forward but still hidden under a veil of calm. The thing about being ignored for so long is that it builds up, layer by layer, until one day, you can't keep it inside anymore. It starts to feel like a pressure cooker, and one wrong move can make it explode. And one day, Maya made that wrong move. It wasn't anything major, at least not in the way she would see it. But it was enough. It was the day she asked me to clear out the guest room for her bridal party. The request came without any consideration. As usual, it wasn't a question, and it wasn't a request, it was an expectation. I need that room for the bridesmaids, she said, waving her hand as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I know it's your room, but I need it, so you'll have to move your stuff. There was a moment, just a split second, where I felt like I might snap. I felt something dark rise in me, something I couldn't ignore. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated rage, followed by a deep sense of helplessness. I stood there in the hallway, staring at Maya's back as she walked away, a smug smile on her face as she juggled her plans and phone calls. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her to stop, to give me just a shred of respect, just a sliver of acknowledgement. But I didn't. Instead, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet resolve. I realized I didn't have to ask for permission anymore. I didn't need to beg for a seat at the table. It was time to make my own rules. That night, while the house was quiet and the world outside seemed far away, I made my decision. It wasn't something I thought through, or something I planned meticulously. It wasn't rational, and it wasn't the right thing to do, but it felt like the only thing I could do. I went to the hardware store and bought a new set of locks. Just the thought of it made my heart beat a little faster, a little harder. The simple act of buying a lock felt like I was taking control of something, anything. I didn't tell anyone, didn't even mention it. I was just going to do it. By the time I was done, the locks were changed, the old ones taken out and hidden away in a drawer. It felt surreal, like I was crossing a line. But I wasn't sure which one. There was no going back now. Maya was going to have to face the consequences of her behavior. She wasn't going to get to use my house for her wedding. Not after everything she'd done. Not after everything I had silently endured. The next morning, as I stood by the front door, looking at the shiny new lock that was now separating me from the world, I felt an odd sense of satisfaction. I hadn't been invited to the wedding, so I wasn't going to let it happen here. Not on my terms, not anymore. The morning of the wedding arrived with an unsettling sense of finality. The house was eerily quiet. There was no excitement in the air, no hustle and bustle of last-minute preparations. In a way, it felt like the calm before a storm, just me and the house, locked in a strange truce. I knew Maya was on her way. She had called a dozen times in the past 24 hours. But I hadn't answered. It didn't feel like there was anything left to say. The decision had been made, and I was standing firm. The wedding was supposed to be an event of grand proportions. Maya had arranged everything. She'd orchestrated every detail, right down to the tiniest flower petal. She was going to stand at the altar in a beautiful dress, surrounded by everyone who adored her, while I watched from the sidelines. Or rather, I wasn't going to watch at all. I stood by the window, looking out at the driveway. Maya's car was parked at the curb, and I could see the gleam of the bridal party's vehicles coming up the street. A wave of anxiety rippled through me, but I pushed it down. This was happening. It was too late to change it now. When I heard the knock at the door, it felt like the first thunderclap of the storm. I opened the peephole, watching as Maya stood there, flanked by her bridesmaids, all giddy with excitement. Her smile faltered when she saw the lock on the door, her hand hovering in midair as if she were trying to comprehend why it was there. She knocked again, more forcefully this time, and then pounded on the door. "Jordan, open the door." Her voice was shrill now, a mixture of confusion and frustration. "What are you doing? The wedding's today. Let us in." I didn't move. I didn't answer. The weight of the silence between us felt heavy, like 1,000 unsaid words pressing against me. Maya knocked again, this time with desperation in her voice. "Jordan, what's going on? This is my wedding day. Open the door." I could hear her voice tremble slightly, the edge of panic creeping in. But I wasn't moved. The years of being ignored, the years of sacrificing my own happiness for the family's convenience, it all rushed over me in a single wave. It was all coming to a head. I stood in the shadows, my hand resting on the doorframe, listening as Maya's pleas grew more frantic. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Instead, I felt empty. A part of me had hoped this would be a moment of triumph. But now it felt hollow. There was no joy in watching her frustration. There was only silence. Finally, there was a pause, a long, still moment where everything hung in the air. I could hear the muffled voices of the bridesmaids behind her, whispering among themselves, confused and unsure of what to do next. Maya had stopped banging, and I could imagine the look on her face, her smooth features twisted in confusion. Her perfect wedding plans unraveling right before her. I didn't have to open the door. I didn't have to let her in. It didn't take long for the chaos to unfold. Within the hour, my phone was ringing, constantly calls from my family, from Maya, from everyone who had been invited to the wedding. But I didn't answer. What had started as a simple act of defiance had turned into something more. Something I wasn't entirely prepared for. I wasn't sure what would happen next. I wasn't sure if this would cause irreparable damage to my relationships with my family. But at that moment, none of it mattered. I had finally done something for myself. As the day wore on, I heard the distant sounds of the guests being redirected, the muffled voices of my family arguing outside. I could only imagine the drama unfolding, Maya probably in tears, Aaron trying to mediate, everyone caught up in the whirlwind of disappointment and confusion. But I didn't want to be part of it. The decision had been made, and I wasn't going to apologize. Not anymore. It's strange how something as small as a locked door can set off a chain reaction that changes everything. When I stood in my hallway, listening to the chaos outside, I had no idea what would come next. All I knew was that I was finally taking control. It wasn't a victory, and it wasn't a defeat, it was simply change. I heard the muffled voices of my family from behind the door, arguing. I didn't bother to listen too closely. I didn't want to hear Maya's frantic pleading or Aaron's attempts to calm everyone down. There was no need for it. I had already made my decision. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I waited in silence, wondering if they were giving up, or if they were trying to find another way in. I never looked out the window, never peeked through the blinds, because I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to see Maya's disappointment on her face, or the looks of confusion from my relatives. Hours passed, and the house remained quiet again, save for the occasional phone call or text message. I ignored them all. It wasn't until the next morning that the reality hit me, the weight of what I'd done. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone as it buzzed relentlessly. My inbox was flooded with angry messages. My mother, Aaron, even distant cousins I hadn't seen in years, all of them demanding answers. I opened Aaron's message first, because his words were always the most direct, the most honest. "Jordan, what the hell happened? Maya's in tears. Mom's livid. I can't believe you'd do this. What were you thinking?" I wanted to respond. I wanted to explain myself. To tell him that it wasn't about Maya or the wedding or even the family. It was about me, about finally standing up for myself after years of being overlooked. But the words didn't come. I wasn't ready to explain. I wasn't even sure I could. I didn't respond to anyone. Instead, I went about my day in a haze, as if the world had shifted around me, and I was the only one standing still. The anger from the day before had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow feeling. It was as though the satisfaction of locking the door had been fleeting. And in its place was something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't sure if I was relieved, ashamed, or just numb. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I froze. I had been expecting someone, but I didn't know who. My heart pounded as I walked to the door. I didn't bother looking through the peephole this time. I knew who it was. I had no intention of running away from this. I opened the door slowly. There stood Aaron, his face a mixture of frustration and concern. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something sharper. He didn't look angry, but I could tell that he was hurt, confused. Behind him was Maya, standing with her arms crossed, her face a mask of tension. She didn't look like the glowing bride from the day before. Instead, she looked small, vulnerable, even. I stepped aside to let them in, but I didn't speak. I didn't have any words. Aaron walked past me, into the living room, and Maya followed, her eyes on the floor. The silence between us stretched thin, and I could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the tension that clung to the air. Finally, Aaron spoke. You need to explain yourself. This isn't just about you, Jordan. You hurt people. You hurt Maya. You hurt Mom. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't yelling, but it was clear he was frustrated. I looked at him, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what I was feeling? How could I make him understand that, for the first time in years, I had done something for myself? That I had finally taken a stand? Maya broke the silence. What was that about? Jordan, why would you do this? You know how important this wedding was to me. You ruined everything. You ruined my day. Her voice was softer than I had expected. There was no anger, no real venom in it. Just hurt. She wasn't shouting. She was simply broken. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her as more than just the picture-perfect bride. I saw her as a woman, just like me, dealing with the chaos of her own life. She wasn't the golden girl anymore. She was just Maya, and I was me. I didn't ruin your day, Maya, I finally said, my voice quiet but steady. I just didn't want to be invisible anymore. I didn't want to keep pretending that I didn't matter. I'm sorry if that hurts you, but I had to do something for myself. Maya's eyes widened slightly, and I could see the flicker of understanding cross her face. But only for a moment. She was still too deep in her own pain to fully comprehend what I was saying. Aaron's face softened a bit, but he still looked at me with concern. You could have talked to us, Jordan. You could have told us how you were feeling. I shook my head. You wouldn't have listened. Not really. The words hung in the air, unspoken for so long, and as they did, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. My silence had been a way of surviving. But now, it was time to speak up. It was time to tell the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The following days were a blur. The wedding was, of course, called off. No one got married. There were tears, there was yelling, and there were long, uncomfortable silences. But through all of it, something shifted. Maya and I had our first real conversation after the lock incident. It wasn't a warm conversation, it wasn't full of apologies or promises to do better. But it was real. We talked about the things we had never talked about before. The unspoken jealousy, the ways we had both been trapped in our roles, unwilling to change. Maya didn't apologize, at least not in the way I expected. But she did say something that made me pause. I didn't realize how much I was taking from you. I thought you didn't care. I thought you were fine. But I see now, I was wrong. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We didn't hug or make up. But it was the start of something new. Aaron was quieter after the confrontation. He didn't fully understand why I did it. But he didn't blame me either. Slowly, he began to respect my boundaries. It wasn't easy, but he tried, and I appreciated that. The family, well, they weren't as forgiving. My mother's disapproval was hard to bear, and there were still awkward conversations. But over time, they began to see that I wasn't the person they thought I was. I wasn't just the quiet one who always went along with everything. I was someone who could stand up for herself. And, in the end, that's what the wedding was really about. It wasn't about the dress, the guests, or the flowers. It was about two people standing in front of each other and making a choice. But sometimes, the hardest choice of all is choosing yourself. After that day, after the confrontation at the door and the fallout from the wedding disaster, things slowly began to change. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but there was a shift. I had expected more anger, more resentment. I had braced myself for the cold stares and the whispered conversations behind my back. But what I got instead was uncertainty. People were unsure of how to approach me now. My family wasn't used to me standing my ground. It felt like I was living in a strange limbo, neither part of the family's expectations nor fully outside of them. I had forced their hand, made them see me, and now they were grappling with the reality that I wasn't just the quiet sister-in-law, the one who smiled politely and went along with everything. I wasn't invisible anymore. Maya, to her credit, seemed to try harder after the dust had settled. She reached out more, albeit in her own way. Instead of the cold indifference I had grown used to, I started getting small gestures. A text here or there, a comment on my social media posts. Slowly, her walls came down, but the relationship was different now. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even easy, but it was something. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't revisit that day. There was no need. What mattered was that we were beginning to understand each other in a way we never had before. Aaron was another story. At first, he had been concerned, trying to be the peacemaker, attempting to navigate between me and the rest of the family. But as time went on, I could tell he was processing his own feelings. He hadn't known I felt so ignored. He hadn't realized how much I had sacrificed in silence, how much I had given up just to keep the peace. There was an awkwardness between us for a while, but it wasn't the same kind of tension I'd had with Maya. It was more like a quiet realization that we had both changed. One night, a few weeks after the wedding, we sat down over dinner at my place. It was a rare occasion. Aaron had come by to check on me, to see how I was doing. The tension had subsided enough that we could have a conversation without it turning into a debate or an argument. "You've been quiet lately," he said, poking at his food but not really eating. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I've been figuring things out." Aaron nodded, his expression softening. He looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time, and then he finally spoke the words I had been waiting for. "I didn't get it, why you did what you did. But I think I understand now. It wasn't about the wedding, was it?" I shook my head, taking a deep breath. "No, it was never about the wedding. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't matter, that I didn't have a say in my own life." Aaron reached across the table and put his hand on mine. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. "I'm sorry, Jordan. I should have listened. I should have seen it." I squeezed his hand, the weight of the moment sinking in. There was so much left unsaid, so many years of miscommunication. But for the first time, we were both finally listening to what wasn't being said, as much as what was. "I don't need you to apologize," I told him, my voice steady. "I just need you to remember that I'm here, that I'm me, not just someone in the background." He nodded, and for the first time, I felt like we were on the same page, not just as siblings, but as people who had both been through things we hadn't talked about. It was slow, this rebuilding of relationships. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet just like me. But in that quiet, something was shifting, slowly, but surely. Days turned into weeks, and then into months. Life, in a sense, went on. The world didn't stop because of my actions, even though it had felt like everything had come to a crashing halt at first. The wedding was forgotten, or at least put behind us. People didn't talk about it anymore. It wasn't something I wanted to rehash. And as time passed, it felt like we all let it go. Maya and I would see each other at family events, and there was a subtle understanding between us now. It wasn't perfect, but we didn't need it to be. We had crossed a bridge, and while we hadn't quite reached the other side, we had made it further than we ever had before. But there were moments, little moments, where I could see Maya's vulnerability peeking through her polished exterior. She wasn't the golden girl anymore. She was just a person. Like me, I began to see her differently. Not as the bride who had overshadowed me for so long, but as someone who was still figuring out her own place in the world. The family, too, began to treat me differently. They stopped expecting me to always be the quiet one, the one who smiled and nodded and kept the peace. There was less pressure to fit into their mold. There was room for me to be myself. And with that room, I started to breathe again. But the real change, the change that truly mattered, was with me. I began to realize that the wedding wasn't the only thing I had been locked out of. For years, I had been locked out of my own life. I had been playing the role of the silent observer, the passive participant, and I wasn't okay with that anymore. I found myself doing things I had always put off. I started volunteering at a local animal shelter, something I had always wanted to do but never had the courage to pursue. I reconnected with old friends, ones I had neglected over the years because I'd been too busy being the family's peacekeeper. And slowly, I began to realize that I didn't need to ask for permission to be happy. I didn't need to wait for someone else's approval to live my life. The lock that had once kept me out was no longer there. It had never been about the house, or the wedding, or even Maya. It had been about me taking control. And once I did that, I started to feel free in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't until several months later that the real resolution came. The day Maya called me, almost out of the blue, to tell me that she had finally rescheduled the wedding. She was getting married, not to the man she had planned to marry originally. That relationship had dissolved in the aftermath of the cancelled wedding. But she was getting married. And this time, she wasn't asking for my forgiveness or permission. She was simply telling me, "I wanted to tell you first," she said over the phone. "It's happening, Jordan. I found someone who actually listens to me." I was quiet for a moment, processing her words. And then, for the first time, I smiled. "That's great, Maya," I said. "I'm happy for you." She paused, almost as if she expected something more. "You don't hate me?" I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. "No, I don't hate you. I don't even know if I'm mad anymore. But I do know this. You've got to start listening to yourself. I think you'll be all right this time." "I hope so," she replied softly, before adding, "Thank you, Jordan." It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. It was something else entirely. And it was enough. And for the first time in my life, I realized that being at the center of someone else's life wasn't the only way to be seen. I was enough, just as I was. I had carved out a space for myself in a way that had been long overdue. The wedding wasn't perfect, but neither was I, and that was okay. Life after Maya's second wedding announcement wasn't exactly smooth, but there was an undeniable shift. I had never expected that our relationship would become the way it was. But somehow, it was becoming healthier, if not entirely healed, one step at a time. The tension that had once clouded every interaction was no longer there. For the first time, I felt like I had a seat at the table, and it wasn't something I had to fight for anymore. After Maya's call, I didn't hear from her for a while. She was busy with her new life, and I was busy with mine. It was the first time in years that I didn't feel like I had to constantly make space for others. I was learning how to make space for me. I started focusing more on my career, taking on new projects that I had once hesitated to commit to. I even moved forward with a decision that had been in the back of my mind for years. I signed up for a writing course. It felt ridiculous at first, like a dream I wasn't allowed to have. But when I sat down to write my first assignment, I felt a quiet sense of pride. I was doing something for myself, not because someone else expected it, but because I wanted to. It was in that class, that quiet Tuesday night, that I realized something profound. I had been waiting for someone to give me permission to live. I had been waiting for validation that I was allowed to take up space, to matter, to voice my needs. But the truth was, permission had always been in my hands. I just needed to take it. The writing class became my anchor. I started submitting pieces, getting feedback, and for the first time in years, I felt the spark of excitement I hadn't felt in so long. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Aaron noticed the change, too. He had always been my protector, my quiet advocate, but as I grew more confident, I could see a mix of pride and concern on his face. We had spent so many years in our own private worlds, barely understanding the other's needs. But now things were different. When we talked, it wasn't just about logistics or family obligations. It was about real things, the things that mattered. We shared hopes, fears, and even regrets. The most telling moment came when Aaron came to visit me after I had been promoted at work. He sat on the couch, looking at me with a mix of amusement and admiration. "I can't believe how much you've changed. I don't even know where to begin." I laughed, feeling a mix of gratitude and humility. I think I've finally stopped waiting for something to happen. I just made it happen. Aaron chuckled. That's a lesson I could stand to learn. We didn't talk about the wedding anymore. It was over. A chapter we had all closed. Even though it had taken far too long to get there. What mattered now was that we were both finally speaking up. Finally moving toward our own lives. Months passed, and Maya's wedding finally happened. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't perfect. But it was hers. It was what she had wanted for herself. And not because of anyone's expectations or pressure. I attended. Of course. I had promised her I would. And this time, there was no bitterness in it. I watched her walk down the aisle with someone who truly saw her. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I had spent so much time resenting her, comparing myself to her, and allowing my frustration with her choices to take up far too much space in my mind. But as I sat there, watching her marry the man she chose, I realized that it wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. I was finally free of the invisible chains that had kept me tethered to my old role. It wasn't perfect. It didn't fix everything, but it was a moment of understanding. A quiet acknowledgement that we had both grown. And that growth wasn't just about reconciliation with her, it was about reconciling with myself. I didn't need to be anyone other than who I was. I didn't need to apologize for my decisions. I didn't need to shrink to fit into anyone's mold. I was enough. The day after the wedding, Maya called me. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for being there. I wouldn't have missed it." I replied, "I'm happy for you." She didn't say much after that, but I could hear the sincerity in her voice. It wasn't about us being close again. It was about respect, about understanding that we had both walked our own paths and that, despite it all, we were still part of the same family. As the months turned into a year, I found myself growing even more comfortable in my own skin. There were still bumps along the way, awkward family gatherings, difficult moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, but I was different now. I knew my worth. I knew my voice. I knew how to take up space without feeling guilty for doing so. I had stopped waiting for life to hand me a clear path. Instead, I had learned to forge my own. The real turning point came when I wrote my first full-length piece, a personal essay about the journey I had gone through. About the silence I had endured and the steps I had taken to reclaim my voice. I submitted it to a literary magazine, not expecting much but hoping for a small victory. When I got the email confirming it would be published, I couldn't believe it. The story I had told was mine. And it mattered. It had been the culmination of everything I had gone through, everything I had learned. That night, after the acceptance email arrived, I sent a message to Aaron. "I did it. My first piece is getting published." His reply was simple but meaningful. "I knew you would." For the first time, I realized I didn't need validation from anyone else. I had earned this moment. I had fought for it. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, a sense of calm washed over me. I had no idea where the future would take me. But for once, I was excited to find out. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was living my life the way I had always wanted to. On my own terms. In the months that followed, my life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. My writing career took off, and I started to be recognized for my work. The peace I had fought so hard to create in my life was no longer fleeting, it was permanent. I could breathe again. I had the space to be who I truly was, without worrying about what anyone else thought. Maya and I never became best friends, but we no longer had the tension between us. We both knew we had come a long way. And while we wouldn't ever be the picture-perfect sisters that others might have expected, we were something even better. We were two women who had learned to exist in the same space, even if that space was sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. As for Aaron, our relationship had deepened. We weren't just siblings anymore. We were allies, partners in life. He understood me in a way he never had before. And I understood him, too. I didn't need a wedding to make me feel whole. I didn't need a grand gesture to prove my worth. What I had was mine. My life, my choices, my voice, and that, for the first time, felt like enough.